So talk about color today. I'm going to break this section down into multiple smaller components because it's a pretty big topic, especially related to art and design. And if you're taking an art class right now, or will take an art class, you'll get some of this again. It's a lot of similar content, but we're looking at it through the lens of a designer. And some of the basics that we want to look at with color are how we talk about it, because that's different in what we do as graphic designers, similar to other topics or areas, but we're talking about the name of a color, which is known as hue. We're talking about value, how light or dark it is. We're talking about saturation, or its brilliance, its intensity, its dullness, where it's lost kind of most of its saturation. You also add in the ideas of tint and shade, and those things are helpful because as we're working on something, we may want to stick with a similar color, but we want to add a little bit, make it a little bit darker or make it a little bit lighter. So we'll look at those things at a starting point. Those are terminology that we're going to end up using quite a bit. So we think about hue. We look here just an example of what, those are all different hues. We have, and the language that you use when naming the hue is based on your background, based on how much you've studied color or thought about color before. So we have, I could call it a blue, orange, red, blue, and green, but the blues aren't the same. So we have to think about different language that we use when we're talking about that. We talked about it. I just mentioned saturation and the vibrance of that color, or the brightness of it. Well, brightness and value is a little bit different, but how do we look at how intense that color is? Or is it a little more gray? Is it a little brighter? Is it a little bit light to dark? Is another range there for brightness and value. So again, some visual references on how we look at particular color. Another way that we talk about color is the surface of what we're using. What we see on screen, we've looked at this already, what you see on screen versus what is printed, that is a difference. And what you see in the printer in our classroom is completely different from the printer down the hall. Now, in theory, those would be perfect and exact, and as designers, that's something we have to pay attention to. But when we use different surfaces, that makes a difference. So the different type of paper that we would use would change the way that the color looks. If you look at a magazine versus something that's printed in a newspaper, for example, those two types of papers are different. One's got a coated sense to it, the other one is uncoated. So the way that the ink interacts with the paper or the surface changes. Think about photographs and photographs that are matte versus glossy. That looks different, right? So knowing where we're going, what the audience we're working with, and what kind of connections they have as well is important to consider. Thinking about what are their connections in their mind, what are their connections in their culture, in their race, in their country they're from, what's their history, what are their preferences. All of those change how we react to color. For example, if you think about, if I say the color red, some of you might think of a sports team, some of you might think of an emotion, some of you might think of some kind of clothing that you have, or something like that. Like, you all have that association and preference based on who you are. So we need to pay attention to that, right? One of the tools that we're going to be using is Pantone. Pantone is a system of colors that are in a way kind of just determined and guaranteed that what it looks like on the swatch book, that's actually how it's going to look when it's printed. But if you look here at the example, we have coated versus uncoated, and you can see, well, we interpret color each differently because of our eyes. But if you don't, you might see the difference between the color on the left and the color on the right, the blue on coated paper versus the blue on uncoated paper, and how that changes it. Right, so you can, if you really looked a little bit deeper, you'll notice that this has a 290C for coated or 290U for uncoated. Something to pay attention to. The reason that interacts that way, or that we see it that way, is how light shines and reflects off of something that's been printed on. And if it's coated paper, it has kind of this finish, and it's going to come back to our eyes quite accurately, quite quickly, quite directly. Where if it's uncoated paper, again, thinking like a newspaper, there's all these ways that light can bounce off the surface in a less strong way. So that's good to know the difference between coated and uncoated. Not that it's perfect, but it's good to pay attention to that. Okay. So if we look at any of these, I said already that there's added meaning to each one of the colors that we choose. And if we look at this is all the same composition, all the same text, all the same imagery, but what changes is the color. So you look at one of these, it might be about poison, or it might be about death, or it might be about negative looking at this project, or some of it might be hope, some of it might be things that are growing. A lot of different ways just based on color can change the meaning of what it is that you're actually composing, what you're actually communicating, right? So two ways that we can look at color. One of them is color is produced by light, and we start with black, right? So if you look at your monitors, everything that's turned off, screen is black, TV is black, whatever, there's no color at all. In theory, what we actually add is color to it, and all of those colors together, and our primaries in that are RGB, red, green, and blue. And if we add light to that, we get white. It's kind of the theory behind it. So anything that we see, we turn the lights off on a switch in a room, all the lights make the room dark, right? It's the absence of all color, or the absence of all color and light. It's something to think about. Kind of breaks it down this way. So we see light, all color coming through, or all light coming through, it's white, and then we can break it down even further. And you've probably seen Roy G. Biv before, but how we actually break down and make a spectrum. So just kind of a reference about how we see light. White light is actually a combination of all of these colors. The other way that we look at it is through design. Is known as pigment, or using paint, or using ink, or in our sense, most often printing. And it's the opposite mode. So we have lack of color, everything's white, and we add, and our primary colors in this method are CMY, cyan, magenta, and yellow. And if we look at it that way, we add in all of those colors, a full amount of cyan, a full amount of magenta, a full amount of yellow, and we get black. The theory is, though, that, or the actuality is that black isn't perfect. So we add K, black, for this. So CMYK is our printed mode. We work on screen in RGB, and then we print in CMYK. And that looks a little bit different, something like this. So on the right-hand side, you'll see these colors that are actually built using the first column on any one of these rows is cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And they use these halftone dots, and these dots are overlapping. They're somewhat translucent so that the light shines through and then bounces back to our eyes, if you want to think about it that way. But we take, for example, the first two rows have a lot more cyan. The second one has a lot less magenta, but a lot more yellow. So you can see how this range of things makes a completely different color. It's cyan plus magenta plus yellow plus black. The one in the bottom has a complete set of halftone dots, a lot more magenta and yellow, not much cyan and black, to kind of make that reddish color. We'll look at that in a little bit as we actually see looking through some things that have been printed in lens that way. But here's a breakdown of that same way. So if I take this image to the left, photograph, break it down into CMYK, you can see that anywhere that there's white on the right-hand side of the cyan, magenta, yellow, or black, anywhere there's white, there's not any of that color. So for example, if you look at the cyan and the balloons in the cyan, there's not many that have much blue, right? And there's not many balloons that have much black. Makes sense. Balloons we don't see that color that way. But if you look at the magenta, there's quite a few balloons that have a magenta color. Some you can actually see on the full-on photograph. Some of them you see more referenced in the actual magenta. But that's kind of a breakdown of how this photograph, something that's been printed, is actually seen. Breaking it down that way. Cyan, magenta,